Okay, and sharing my screen to the backdrop.
So we are on the air?
Not yet.
Okay.
We do are on YouTube, I think.
Okay, we're ready to go.
So welcome everyone to our webinar. Thank you very much for joining. This is a very special day for every one of us here at ILGA, as we are launching the update to the global legislation overview of our state-sponsored homophobia report. My name is Lucas Ramon Mendoz, and I'm ILGA World's research coordinator. I will be moderating this session with the help from colleagues Daniele Paletta and Maddalena Tomasini. The spotlight today will be with a fabulous panel of extremely talented researchers that have worked really hard to produce this update. They are joining from all corners of the world, so for some of them it's very early in the morning, for others it's quite late at night. So I just happen to be lucky to be in between here in Geneva, a very cold Geneva today. Hope the rain is not getting in the mic. There's going to be interpretation available in Spanish. Si todavía me están escuchando en español, hay un botón de interpretación el cual pueden acceder y escuchar con la interpretación simultánea. This session is going to be recorded and made available through our YouTube channel later on today. And we also have a we have a possibility of asking questions through the chat box. So if throughout the presentation you have any questions that you would like the panel to address at the end of the session, we'll be happy to receive them through the Q&A box. So before we actually begin, we're going to share with you a video that the Communications Office has produced for the launch of the report. So whenever we're ready, we should go again with the first video. So apparently we have no sound. We will check if we have any technical difficulties and replay the video for you in a minute.
2020 in one word: uncertainty. We are all wondering what the new normal will be like. And for many, this year has been a heavy blow. The consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic have left many struggling to survive in a world that has become even more unequal and violent. And where laws are already a cause of inequality, things have only got worse. ILGA World's state-sponsored homophobia report looks at laws that affect people on the grounds of their sexual orientation. 69 countries still criminalize people because of whom they love. We know that at least 34 UN member states have enforced laws that criminalize people on the grounds of their sexual orientation in the past 5 years. But the numbers might be much higher. In these countries, people may get reported and arrested just under the suspicion of having sex with someone of the same gender. Courts actively prosecute and sentence them to jail, public flogging, or even death. Many more provisions are being advanced across the world to target people because of their sexual orientation. To name a few, LGBT-free zones spread in Poland. Indonesia is giving a new boost to conversion therapies, and Florida has just reversed 2 state bans on this dangerous practice. These are worrying developments. Laws to protect our rights are more vital than ever, especially in times like these. Our lives are at stake, but our movement hasn't remained silent. And eventually, against all odds, our global community has achieved progress. Even during this frightening year, Sudan repealed the death penalty for consensual same-sex intimacy, and Gabon decriminalized it. Germany banned conversion therapies. States and provinces in Australia, Canada, Mexico, and the United States have followed suit. Costa Rica legalized marriage equality, a first in Central America. Monaco and Montenegro adopted laws that protect same-sex unions. Many states made it clear it is not okay to discriminate. In the United States, the Supreme Court determined that federal law protects LGBT people from being fired because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Switzerland banned hate speech and discrimination based on sexual orientation. Meanwhile, some parts of Italy, Peru, and Philippines are paving the way with new laws to protect us. Although they continue to criminalize our laws, Barbados now bans sexual orientation discrimination in the workplace, and Singapore protects sexual minorities from violence based on supposed religious beliefs. Several Caribbean countries now include murders motivated by the victim's sexual orientation among the most serious crimes that could lead to a lifetime in prison. North Macedonia re-adopted its anti-discrimination law only a few months after repealing it. In South Africa, public officials cannot refuse to solemnize same-sex unions anymore. Some jurisdictions in Japan now allow same-sex unions and have anti-discrimination protections. The Marshall Islands became the latest UN member state offering legal protection from discrimination based on sexual orientation. Today, 81 UN member states offer protection in employment. 20 years ago, they were only 15. You see, 2020 had some good news after all. And none of this would have happened if our communities had not continued to push for change. Even in all this uncertainty, we have come this far, but a much longer road lies ahead until we reach a world that is truly free and equal for all of us. 2020 in one word: uncertainty.
Our appreciation to the communications office for that video. And it really sums up, a lot of the good news that we have on the report. So jumping in to our first panelist, we have Rafael Carrano Lelis. He's a lawyer and a researcher focused on LGBTI rights based in Brazil. And he's currently consulting for ILGA. Rafael, the floor is totally yours.
Hey, Lucas, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'll share my screen with you now. Hopefully, you'll be able to see the slides I prepared. Yeah, everyone can see it?
Great.
Okay, great. So I'm really glad everyone could join today so we can discuss a little bit of our research and the process of elaboration of this year's edition of the state-sponsored homophobia report. I'll briefly address two sections of the report and then leave the floor for my colleagues to cover the rest. So basically, the first one is the methodology section. And as many of you may know, this is the first time we have actually included a separate section on this issue in the report. So I think a good question to start with is why a section on methodology? And I think the important thing here is to encourage you all to read it before jumping into the more attractive part of the report, which I know might be tempting, going directly to the data and the new information we display. But I think reading the methodology section, it will help you a lot in understanding everything that we cover, because it's there we explain our methodological decisions. For instance, why you have included some countries and not others in a given section. So it's basically a guide for you to better understand all nuances of our report. In this section, we cover 7 different topics, as you see listed in this slide. I won't go into each one of them in depth. I just leave it there so that you can, in the future, go and read which interests you the most. But I want to highlight at least three of the things we've added in the methodology section. So the first one regards our sources. I think something that people often wonder is where do we get our data from? Because we cover a lot of countries and now a whole lot more of territories. So I think the easiest answer is everywhere, because covering so many territories and countries, we need to go everywhere to find the right data and a reliable source. But in this edition, we try to list all the main sources we use in the report, and those are all of those 11. And in the section, we take the time to briefly explain how they play different parts in the construction of the research. So you see they are really different, like they go from legislation, case law to academia and local activists. So when you go into the methodology section, you understand how we value and different applied each source in the construction of the report. Another important issue regards the jurisdictions we cover, and I want to highlight the new ones. We historically track UN member states and some non-UN member states, but for this edition, we started adding non-independent territories. And this reinforces our commitment to members of our communities everywhere, regardless of the political status of their territories, as it is highlighted in the Co-Secretaries General forward in the report. So for instance, you see that now Greenland and French Guyana and Bermuda all have their separate entries to track legal development. And we have also added now supranational jurisdictions within UN member states, which do not have a nationwide law. So for instance, if you go to the broad protection section, below the entry for Brazil, you see we have now several new entries covering legislations enacted in states that protect from discrimination based on sexual orientation. The last part I want to highlight in the methodology section is that we have included criteria applied in specific sections of the report. I've listed the main ones here. I won't go into all of them, as I hope you'll be reading all of the section later after this event. But I wanted to call attention to the fact that we have now added a deep and comprehensive explanation as to how we determine the date for decriminalization of consensual same-sex sexual acts in each country, something that has been controversial in the past, and still today there are several paths that could be followed in defining those dates. So we have added this comprehensive explanation, and hopefully you agree with the path we've took. And finally, I want just to give a few highlights of this second session, the one on consensual same-sex sexual acts, specifically the part where we cover the countries that do not criminalize it. So as also explained in the methodology section, we have changed a few criteria for defining dates, and it's all at length explained that, but I wanted to call attention to the fact that some countries now have a never crime tag. And this means that we have not found enough evidence that they have actually ever criminalized consensual same-sex sexual acts. So they probably never criminalized. So that's why we added this tag never crime, and we did not include a year. Also, some of you might notice that the year of decriminalization for Angola has changed from previous editions to this one. This is due to new developments in the country. The new penal code, which had decriminalized same-sex sexual acts, was finally published this year, and it will enter into force in 2021. So we changed this now, and it was previously 2019 and now 2021. And we did this because these new developments got more reliable information for us, so we can certain that the date of entry into force will be 2021. And finally, some new additions in the section. We have Gabon back on the list after having criminalized last year and decriminalized in 2020, so that's good news. We have also added one non-UN member state, which is Vatican City, that although opposing to some developments in social law worldwide, they have actually never criminalized since 1890, which was when Italy first decriminalized its territory. And finally, the addition of non-independent jurisdictions also affected this section, as we have now 41 new entries from almost all regions of the world. That's basically what I wanted to really quickly share with you. I'll throw the ball back to Lucas now so that we can continue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam Rafael, for that very brief presentation, but it speaks to the way in which we have expanded many of the sections of the report. Just to give you a brief idea of how much we've expanded the report, when we published this edition, the 2017 edition, this section, the Global Legislation Overview, was 50 pages long, and the one we're publishing today is almost 350 pages long. So there's a lot of contextual information and additional information that the research team was able to gather and systematize in the report. Our next speaker, Enrique López de la Peña. Enrique is a research consultant at ILGA. He's originally from Mexico and Hong Kong, and he has lived in 6 countries thus far: the United Arab Emirates, China, France, Israel, and the United States of America. He earned his Bachelor of Arts in Political Science with minors in Linguistics and Arabic from New York University, Abu Dhabi in 2019. His research interests include political psychology, international conflict prevention and resolution, forced displacement, climate change, diversity, interculturalism, and LGBTI rights. Enrique, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lucas. To all of our listeners, hello, wherever you are in the world. It is an enormous pleasure to have you here with us today. I will be telling you a bit more about 3 sections within our report. Namely, these are the sections on the death penalty, criminalization, and legal barriers to the freedom of association. We are delighted to announce that this year's update of our state-sponsored homophobia report includes a section focusing specifically on the death penalty on the grounds of consensual same-sex sexual activity. We begin this section by laying out the standards that have been adopted in regard to capital punishment under international law, presenting substantial evidence that the death penalty for consensual same-sex sexual acts is contrary to United Nations standards. We go on to provide a brief explanation of how Islamic Sharia law functions, given that this is an important source of the relevant legislation in all states where the death penalty for consensual same-sex acts is currently possible. Sharia law alludes to consensual same-sex acts in 3 main forms. The first is zina, which in Arabic means adultery, fornication, or basically any form of sex outside of a heterosexual marriage. The second form is liwat, which is usually understood as the equivalent of sodomy. And the third one is sihaq, which is most often translated as lesbianism. Disagreements exist regarding the punishments that each of these crimes attract under Sharia, but all major schools of Islamic jurisprudence agree that zina, liwat, and sihaq fall under the haram or forbidden category of human conduct and can therefore be penalized with corporal punishment at best or the death penalty at worst. Although a small number of Muslim scholars and civil society organizations of faith have disputed this. As of December 2020, we have identified a total of 11 states where the death penalty for consensual same-sex acts is effective or possible under local legislation. We have divided these states into 2 tiers. Tier 1 states are those where there is full legal certainty. In other words, these are the states where the claim that the death penalty can be legally imposed for consensual same-sex conduct is not disputed. This category includes Brunei, Iran, Mauritania, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and northern Nigeria. With the exception of Saudi Arabia, where laws derive directly from the Quran and the Sunnah, all Tier 1 states have codified laws unequivocally prescribing the death penalty for consensual same-sex acts. In contrast, Tier 2 states are those where the applicability of the relevant provisions has been disputed by scholars and experts who have suggested alternative interpretations for the more ambiguous provisions in question. This category includes Afghanistan, Pakistan, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Somalia, including Somaliland. These are also the states where we have no knowledge of instances of the death penalty for consensual same-sex acts being enforced by state authorities. But, needless to say, this does not necessarily mean that the situation for LGBTI people on the ground is any less hostile compared to Tier 1 states. It could be that enforcement incidents are simply not being reported due to multiple reasons. In the cases of Afghanistan and Somalia in particular, we do know of instances where people have been killed for consensual same-sex acts by non-state actors, usually fundamentalist groups such as the Taliban or the Shabab. It is worth highlighting that until very recently, Sudan would have also been listed among our death penalty section's Tier 1 states. Article 148 of the Sudanese Penal Code allowed for the penalization of consensual sodomy with 100 lashes and 5 years in prison for the first and second convictions, and capital punishment for the third one. In July 2020, these provisions were eliminated as Article 148 was amended. Nevertheless, this victory was bittersweet and leaves a lot to be desired, as the Sudanese Penal Code currently in force retained severe forms of criminalization of consensual sodomy. 5 years in prison for the first conviction, 7 years for the second, and life in prison for the third one. Our team's hard work and dedication also allowed us to revamp one of our previously existing sections, namely that of countries where consensual same-sex sexual activity remains illegal. In this edition of State-Sponsored Homophobia, we have elaborated on the exact provisions that are in place in each of the states that criminalize. There are a total of 69 countries in this section. It might come as a surprise to our readers, as it was certainly shocking for many of us to learn, that corporal punishment for consensual same-sex activity is a legal possibility in at least 8 of these states. Life imprisonment is legally possible in at least 9 of them. Fines, in addition to time in prison, are legally possible in at least 19 of them. Forced labor is a legal possibility in Jamaica and St. Kitts and Nevis, as well as the Southern Korean military. Finally, in the Caribbean nation of Dominica, consensual same-sex acts can be legally punished with forced psychiatric treatment. Yes, you heard that right. An additional feature that our criminalization section now includes is a series of relevant instances of enforcement. Our hope is that these additions will serve to tackle the widespread misconception that some of these laws are dormant and have no real effect in people's lives, and to highlight the very real and oftentimes life-threatening risks faced by our communities on a daily basis. It has been brought to our attention that asylum requests by LGBTI people have been recently denied under the pretense that there are no reported instances of enforcement in their respective countries of origin. Therefore, and I cannot emphasize this enough, we strongly hope that our report will serve as a tool for the production of more thorough and accurate country of origin reports worldwide, with the ultimate intention to help LGBTI asylum seekers as much as possible. It is worth recalling, however, that the state-sponsored homophobia report has thus far been cited by a vast array of academics, activists, advocacy groups, international organizations, and governments worldwide, as well as United Nations agencies, special procedures, and treaty bodies. The report has also been cited in historical decisions by Supreme Courts, such as the one that decriminalized consensual same-sex acts in India, and the ones that legalized same-sex marriage in Argentina and Ecuador. Last but not least, in our section on legal barriers to freedom of association, we have added 10 countries that we have determined meet our criteria after careful analysis. We kept our previous division of states into 2 tiers, depending on factors such as whether there are any known LGBTI organizations operating locally and any reports of failed registration attempts. In most countries in this section, NGO laws are worded quite vaguely, for instance, prohibiting the registration of groups when their activities are illegal, immoral, or undesirable, but these provisions continue to harm LGBTI human rights groups disproportionately. Other laws and bills listed in this section are not specific to SOGI issues, but have similarly negative effects. For instance, a recently approved law in Nicaragua requires any activists and NGOs to register as foreign agents when they receive funding from abroad, as is the case with many LGBTI NGOs. This leaves them subject to broad governmental supervision and arbitrary closures. Very similar laws exist in Russia, Hungary, and Azerbaijan, and very similar bills are currently under discussion in Poland, Bulgaria, and Venezuela. To conclude, we zero in on developments that point to an increasingly hostile context for local LGBTI groups in Uganda, Tanzania, and Senegal. And without further ado, I now yield the word to my next colleague.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Enrique, for that very comprehensive presentation. Actually, we're going to share a lot of information, but this is just an overview of the data that you will be able to find in the report. In the report, we include the sources that we have relied on to include that information, and a direct link is provided so that readers can go and read the original source directly in whatever language the original source is. So we both have sources for legal issues hyperlinked in the main charts, and we also provide a formatted footnote with relevant link embedded on the title. So in all, we have worked with more than 3,700 sources in total that provide support for the information that we have included in this edition. Our next speaker is a lawyer, scholar, and activist who has been working with SOGI-esque issues for the last 8 years. He has applied his international human rights law expertise with international and local human rights organizations, most recently as a research intern at ILGA World. His identity will be withheld for safety concerns. So his presentation will be delivered through a video that will now be played by our colleagues in the communications office. Thanks.
Hello everyone, I'm a research intern at ILGA World, and today I will present you several sections of the report I have been working on. The first section describes legal barriers to freedom of expression on sexual and gender diversity issues. This section has two specific features. Firstly, it is not exhaustive and has only information which we became aware of. The main reasons for this limitation are: 1, the diversity of the restrictions' legal forms, including, for example, relevant religious norms, and 2, not all laws contain explicit limitations, so there are additional sources needed for legal interpretation. Secondly, limited understanding of the topic by the local authorities, adopting and chaotically enforcing vague restrictions make it problematic to set apart legal norms related to issues of sexual orientation only from those that relate to gender identity and gender expression. For example, in the United Arab Emirates, laws on modesty have been used against gender diverse people offering sexual services to men. In Mauritania, 8 men were sentenced for inciting debauchery by, quote, imitating women, end of quote, at a birthday party. Therefore, here we talk about both sexual and gender diversity. It is also hard to expect precision in choosing legal terms concerning sexuality from the lawmakers who mix even unrelated and radically different concepts. For example, in some regulations, legislators prohibited promotion and glamorizing of so-called homosexual lifestyle, listed alongside with zoophilia, necrophilia, and incest. Among updates to this section, we reclassified countries into one of 2 tiers, depending on how explicit the regulation is directed to LGBT issues. We updated hyperlinks, dates, articles, provisions of the laws, and added information for constitutive entities. And we also increased the number of countries by 7 because with deeper research, we were able to find more restrictions in Africa, Asia, and Europe. Now, let us discuss the main types of restrictions on freedom of expression we found. The first is the classic, mostly criminal laws related to offenses against morality, good morals, or modesty. In this edition, we found provisions of that type in Burundi, Cote d'Ivoire, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Djibouti, Mauritania, and North Korea. Next, we chronicle different executive standards in the entertainment sphere. For example, we described in 11 paragraphs how over the last 25 years, Singapore adopted regulations to censor positive discussion on homosexuality on TV, internet, radio, movies, magazines, art exhibitions, and most recently, video games. Then we recorded so-called traditional values laws. In Russia, the notorious propaganda law facilitated new prosecutions, from supporting same-sex couples online or administering dating social media groups to thematic theater plays and queer movies. The effects of the now 7-year-old propaganda law reached a new, almost grotesque level of homophobia. As an example, this year the authorities seriously discussed how an ice cream package with a rainbow on it promotes so-called non-traditional sexual relationships. In another instance, they directed teachers to spy on their students' social media profiles and report LGBT content if found. Another example of the official usage of morality discourse is symbolical acts issued by local authorities to protect the Institute of Family in Ukraine and to declare their territories free from LGBT ideology in Poland. Returning to types of restrictions, we observed legal attempts to influence education, from laws against teaching so-called gender ideology in Brazil, Hungary, and Romania, to classic limitations on curriculum, like so-called no Brahma Homo laws in the USA, which remain on books, regardless of legislative challenges and the later US Supreme Court decisions. Last but not least are general laws enforced in a homophobic way. Law enforcement had an essential role for it in Turkey, which has been applying existing legislation to block websites and public manifestation on campus and to prosecute LGBT rights activists and advocates. Finally, we noticed an emerging trend of using anti-pornography laws against LGBT people in Indonesia and Russia. I also want to note the effects of globalization and digitalization that create new forms of restrictions. There is a relatively new practice of ad hoc censorship of international informational products. For example, authorities censored LGBT moments in movies Bohemian Rhapsody in China and Rocketman in the Cook Islands, as well as removed the New York Times articles in Qatar. Another new phenomenon of recent years is personal prosecution for online publications. For example, Iran has charged an official for authorizing the publication of a rainbow family infographic. In 3 instances, Saudi Arabia prosecuted bloggers for a post in support of LGBT people, for a thematic video in TikTok, and for posting a picture of a person wearing leopard print shorts. And there are still more institutionalized forms of limitations on digital expressions, such as attempts to regulate short video platforms in China and to impose bans on dating apps in Pakistan, Indonesia, and Lebanon. Now let's talk about sections devoted to hate crime and hate speech legislation. Among the new developments are the following. First, a new penal code in Angola introduced the commission of the crime because of victim's sexual orientation as an aggravating circumstance, as well as relevant prohibitions of incitement to hatred. Second, Switzerland amended its laws to include sexual orientation in the prohibition of public denigration, discrimination, and incitement to such actions, as well as for the public dissemination of those ideologies. Third, we take note that more than half of Australia's population now lives in states and territories which protect persons from hate speech motivated by their sexual orientation. We also include in the report some newly discovered developments. For example, in 2017, Chad established enhanced punishment for rape when it is motivated by the victim's sexual orientation. Then, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we note the prohibition of incitement to hatred in Republika Srpska. Lastly, our update included many entries of non-independent territories all over the world. We note several bills against hate crimes based on sexual orientation currently under consideration by national legislative bodies in Haiti, South Africa, and Brazil. In Singapore, we note that a draft bill contains the language which protects individuals who share a similar sexual orientation from others who use force or violence on religious grounds against them. In addition, Norway aims to expand a ban on hate speech based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Unfortunately, in Chile, the national legislature recently removed sexual orientation from the bill under discussion, which aimed to prohibit incitement to hatred. Finally, we noticed some other laws which in practice can provide certain protection. The new edition for the first time includes entries reporting on the defamation laws in Israel and Monaco, and in Russia, in at least in 5 instances, courts have recently fined individuals and establishments for homophobic speech under anti-extremism legislation. That's all for now. Thank you for your attention. Stay safe and loud, and happy holidays.
Thank you very much to our colleague for that very thorough presentation. The more we see, now I realize that the information that we have on the report put together into a webinar, that it's only 1 hour, it's like astronaut food. You know, we are dealing with a lot of information, and basically the report will be out. It's already out on our website for you to take the time and go through all of the data that we are overwhelming you with at this time. Our next speaker, Kelly Botha. Kelling is a trans woman from South Africa with a background in media studies and communications advocacy. Before joining our research team, she had also joined ILGA World as a communications intern. Kelling, the floor is yours.
Good day, everyone, and thank you, Lucas, for that introduction. I want to speak briefly about the sections in our report on same-sex marriage, the recognition of same-sex unions, and on the 2 sections on adoptions. I will be condensing these into one topic and skipping over most of the findings, not only because of limited time, but because there is, I think, significant legal and ideological overlap across all of the sections when it comes to the recognition of rainbow families. This year, marriage equality finally reached all corners of the British Isles, with Northern Ireland and the Channel Island of Sark joining the ranks of other jurisdictions over there. Marriage equality also notably came to Costa Rica after a 2018 legal ruling, despite pushback from political conservatives. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic was used by some as a reason to potentially delay marriage legislation coming into effect, but the pandemic did not deter couples from seizing their rights this year. Rather than holding public events, Costa Rica broadcast its first same-sex weddings on TV in order to adhere to health and safety protocols. The adoption of marriage equality also allows couples, if you'll excuse the wordplay, to adopt children. This is a huge but very much underreported boost for rainbow families in that country. Civil union legislation was also adopted in the Cayman Islands after much political back and forth, resulting in the local governor taking executive action. And last year, just before our last report was launched, Monaco also adopted civil union legislation, which didn't make it into the report 1 year ago. Japan has also seen tremendous, albeit not legally binding progress, as several Japanese prefectures, municipalities, and cities are now offering partnership certificates. Now, I've seen a lot of debate around civil unions as being less than marriage, a way for politicians to throw our communities a bone without recognizing us fully. And perhaps that is true, but it is worth bearing in mind, not everyone wants marriage to begin with, and that this kind of legislation can often act as a stepping stone toward fuller equality. Earlier this year, there were reports that Tunisia had recognized same-sex marriage, but it is rare for a relatively conservative country to make such a sudden leap. It was soon revealed that the reporting was incorrect, and local activists urged news outlets around the world to stop spreading the false information for fear of local backlash. In that light, I would like to note that there has been tremendous positive, albeit incremental change in lieu of major shifts. In my own country, the Civil Union Amendment Act was given presidential assent. Until this point, marriage officers in South Africa could refuse to solemnize same-sex unions and weddings, and Home Affairs officials have on several occasions divorced couples without their knowledge or consent when one is transgender, so as not to allow a same-sex marriage to exist under their watch. We are now in a 2-year period of retraining, after which marriage officers will be compelled to officiate all unions. All over the world, we have seen tremendous progress in the recognition of our love, and I could speak for hours about some of the weird and wonderful findings in this section. But I must move on in my remaining time from the warm and fuzzy topic of marriage to the much harsher reality of so-called conversion therapies. I would like to make some very brief notes on our findings on the subject. For a full overview of the legal, political, and ethical ins and outs of this widely disproven and harmful practice, I encourage everyone to look at ILGA World's Curbing Deception report, which came out earlier this year. Overall, we were pleased with the apparent progress in terms of outlawing or limiting the scope of conversion therapies against our communities. We saw bans in several subnational jurisdictions in Australia, Canada, the United States, and Mexico. In Brazil, attempts to overturn a 1999 ban failed, and in Albania, members of the Order of Psychologists are now prohibited from offering conversion therapy, which is tantamount to a national ban. When I say ban, though, it is important to note that not all prohibitions are all-encompassing. Some only limit conversion therapies on the grounds of age, consent, or the type of therapy offered. I also do not want the positive news to overshadow the significant work human rights defenders have ahead of them in this field. This year, Florida overturned 2 county-level bans, and the government of Ecuador snubbed a bill which would have strengthened protections for SOGIESC youth. All across the globe, in fact, our communities, especially the youth, remain vulnerable to harmful conversion practices. In closing, 28 UN member states allow same-sex marriage, 34 recognize same-sex unions in some form or another, and 28 states allow for some form of adoption by same-sex parents. However, only 4 UN member states have nationwide bans on conversion practices, and 10 others have limited scope or localized bans. Thank you. I return the floor to Lucas.
Thank you so much, Kalin. So now we're moving on to our next speaker and last speaker of this day, Darren Tan. Darren is a human rights lawyer and researcher from Singapore. Prior to joining ILGA World, he led a team of lawyers as a frontline legal aid provider to refugees and asylum seekers. Darren, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lucas, for the introduction. A very good evening to everyone, at least in my part of the world, for everyone. And thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time to attend today's webinar. In this edition of our report, we continue to track legal provisions that protect our communities against discrimination on the basis of our sexual orientation. These anti-discrimination provisions are a pivotal vehicle to secure the right to substantive equality. The presence and enforcement of anti-discrimination provisions also serves as a good litmus test of a country's commitment to protecting and fulfilling the human rights of LGBTQ+ individuals. In my section of the presentation, I will provide a brief overview of the key findings since our last report in 3 key areas. Firstly, constitutional protections. Secondly, broad protections. And thirdly, employment protections. These 3 categories follow an approximate hierarchy, with constitutional protections being the highest level of protection, broad protections as the immediate next, and employment protection as the narrowest of the three. First, let me begin with constitutional protections. Most constitutions around the world contain a list of rights and non-discrimination protections, which may sometimes include sexual orientation expressly as a protected characteristic. In terms of constitutional protections, we did not document any major changes in this reporting year. Thus, there are 11 UN member states and 1 non-UN member state that have constitutional protections against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. There is a small but notable trend towards increased broad protections in several countries, which is really, really good news. These broad protections can help prevent acts of discrimination and also provide remedies to victims of acts of discrimination. For instance, the date of entry into force of the new Penal Code of Angola was finally confirmed, and with it will come significant provisions penalizing discrimination based on sexual orientation. In North Macedonia, the law that contains provisions forbidding discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation was reinstated by the parliament in October 2020. Furthermore, Brazil exemplifies how the role of the courts in expanding protections also cannot be understated. The Federal Supreme Court ruled in 2019 to recognize acts of homophobia as included in the definition of racism. Further, we are also optimistic of the potential for increased protections in Italy, where we have an anti-discrimination bill that is due to be discussed by the Senate. Moving on to employment protections, we also observe several positive developments, which is always something worth celebrating. This is really, really encouraging, as a person's ability to earn a living without discrimination is a fundamental human right. These protections can help protect against unfair workplace dismissals or hiring practices solely based on one's sexual orientation. Several jurisdictions passed new laws or amended existing laws to expressly prohibit employment discrimination. These jurisdictions include Angola, Sao Tome and Principe, Barbados, and North Macedonia. Several of these protections are embedded in broader anti-discrimination legislation. Furthermore, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled in June 2020 that employee protections on the basis of sex in the Civil Rights Act will also cover persons with diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. I believe this was also referenced in our introductory video just now. Further, I have more good news to share. We also documented the limited expansion of employment protections in Asia. In Hong Kong, the Court of Final Appeal held that the government cannot withhold spousal benefits to same-sex couples who are legally married under foreign laws. In the Philippines, several cities passed local ordinances prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, including on the grounds of employment. This had the effect of expanding the scope of protection at the sub-national level, as local activists continue to push for national protections. What I've covered so far is a really, really brief overview of the key findings in the area of protection against discrimination. I fully encourage everyone who is interested in learning more to do a deeper dive into the actual report. Before I conclude, I just want to share a really quick final note about trying to understand how legal progress looks like across different jurisdictions. My colleagues have shared about the various laws pertaining to sexual orientation, ranging from criminalization of consensual same-sex sexual conduct, then to restrictions on freedom of expression, and then recognition of same-sex relationships, and now I'm discussing protection against discrimination. As we moved from criminalization and restrictions on the one hand, to protections and recognition on the other hand, from the negative to the positive, it may be tempting to assume that progress of all countries will also adopt this linear trajectory, moving from the negative, decriminalization, to the positive. However, we want to issue a very quick word of caution against that. While this may seem paradoxical, in several countries that continue to criminalize same-sex conduct, activists have also been able to successfully advocate for protective laws against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. Examples of such countries include Barbados and Samoa, among others. Similarly, while constitutional protections may be seen as the most comprehensive form of protection, they may not actually protect against all aspects of violence and discrimination. For instance, while Nepal has constitutional protections against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, it unfortunately lacks legal provisions that protect against incitement of hatred, hate crimes, and conversion therapy. What these brief examples tell us, right, is that this really entrenches the importance of understanding the unique circumstances of each jurisdiction, which all have certain complexities and nuances beyond what we were able to present in this report. Thus, it is our hope that the work that we have devoted to this report can serve as a springboard for further analysis and advocacy work. Thank you very much, and I'm really looking forward to the Q&A portion of today's webinar.
Thank you so much, Darren, for your presentation. There is one information that this situation that we have, that we are flooding everyone and overwhelming everyone with data. And I want just to appreciate the work of our interpreters. We are just mentioning a lot of countries, a lot of numbers and data, and it might be a little bit hard to keep up. So for those who are listening to this webinar in Spanish, please understand that this is a lot of information, and sometimes it might be hard for us to speak at a slow pace, and our interpreters are doing their best, their utter best, to keep up with our speed and with all of this, incredible amount of information. So if there are, any questions and doubts, we will be happy to address those now in the Q&A session. But as well, I urge everyone to go and read the report. We will be happy also to answer questions in writing via email after this webinar. And next year we will be also working on a further updates on the report. So we'll stay in touch with everyone who might be interested. There's another piece of information that I would like to share with everyone. And this might be a bit peculiar, but the number of participants has not decreased considerably since the start of the webinar. This means that most of you have survived the incredible amount of information that we have flooded the screen and the ether with. So thank you so much for staying with us. We do appreciate the time that you take to, show enthusiasm and feedback for our publications. And we do hope that the information that we compile and systematize on the report are largely used. We know that that's the case because we track how the report is being used, but we really hope that the way in which we have enlarged each of the entries will make a difference, especially for those who need this information the most. All right, so we only have a few minutes left, and we will be addressing a few of the questions that many of you have shared through the Q&A chat box. So the first one that we will be addressing is the one on possible developments in 2021. This, of course, might have a combination of information that we were able to track in terms of bills and maybe strategic litigation going on, and some conjecture. So this information, of course, is not part of the report, but this is based on what we have tracked in terms of potential progress. It's not a lot because we try to rely on our sources as much as we can to say for certain that something has happened, but there are indications sometimes when a bill is close to being approved, or in a few cases, as a few of our colleagues will now mention, progress is just on the verge of happening, and we were unable to include that in this report, maybe because it happened just yesterday or maybe last week. But I'm glad to announce that we were able to incorporate progress made in Bolivia only last week. So yeah, that was something that we must be thankful for our designers and people working to put the report together at the very last minute with those additions. So yeah, I will now yield the floor to my colleagues who want to speak to progress in 2021. Please go ahead. Would you like to go ahead, Darren?
Sure, I thought that Rafael might want to go first, but yes, I can share really quickly about some good news that we received last week, even if it was slightly inconvenient because of how late the news came. I think many of you saw the news of Bhutan, the really good news that the two houses of the parliament had voted to decriminalize consensual same-sex sexual acts. And so this is really good news. It came after a bit of political back and forth between the two houses of the parliament. And eventually, I think they were able to come to agreement to scrape the provisions in the penal code that criminalize same-sex conduct. But the law has yet to formally be enacted. The last news we received was that the law would have to receive royal assent before being formally enacted. And we're also not sure about some of the specific legislative process in Bhutan that might follow after this. But I think this is definitely something to look forward to in 2021. Hopefully this law will be formally enacted and our friends over in Bhutan will be able to live in a country that doesn't criminalize their identities.
Yeah, so a quick comment on the same trend in the path to decriminalization. I would just like to call attention again to Angola, which had approved a new penal code in January 2019, which decriminalized consensual same-sex sexual acts. And now, after a long development and news in the legislative process, has finally published its new code in November of 2020. And the new norm will be entering into force in February of 2021. So if nothing changes, which hopefully won't, the decriminalization will be fully effective as of February 2021.
Great, thank you very much, both Raphael and Darren. And of course, feel free to browse the report to see what information we have included on bills that are in the making in several countries. I think every single section has good news, like actual good news and potential good news in the pipeline. So we're really looking forward to a lot more progress being made in 2020. We have another question regarding other publications that ILGA puts out. And I'd like to bring everyone's attention to the fact this publication is exclusively based on issues regarding sexual orientation. And we have another publication that focuses on issues regarding legal issues regarding gender identity and gender expression, and that's the Trans Legal Mapping Report. The third edition of the report was published earlier this year, and it was coordinated by Zam Kiam. Basically, the report covers criminalization of gender diverse people and trans people around the world, and it covers comprehensively the issue of legal gender recognition, so laws and regulations that allow people to amend their gender markers in the documents. So the state-sponsored homophobia report faces exclusively issues of sexual orientation, but that doesn't mean that we also track how laws that criminalize consensual same-sex intimacy may affect trans and gender diverse people on the ground. So I would recommend everyone to have a look at the criminalization section of the report, because many cases of enforcement of laws that in theory criminalize consensual same-sex sexual acts, let's say homosexual acts, are actually enforced in a way that target people because of their gender expression. And as it was mentioned through the webinar as well, cases in which people who might be perceived as male or female entering unions among themselves might also be the target of laws. There was a special case in Pakistan as well that I would like to call everyone's attention to, included in the report as well. We have a last question here on the findings on the situation in Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. So basically, there's another aspect of the report that we also like to bring everyone's attention to. We only focus on the legal aspects of the reality, and we understand that this is only part of what's going on the ground. There are only 3 exceptions to this approach, and it's been mentioned by my colleagues on this webinar. So the criminalization section, in which we look further information on instances of enforcement to see to what extent these laws are being enforced and implemented, so as to debunk the idea that these are dormant laws. The section on restriction to freedom of expression, because the ways in which laws are drafted may not speak directly to sexual and gender diversity, and we need additional information to understand how vague or open laws are used to restrict freedom of expression, and the same thing for restriction of the freedom of association. So there might be laws that may just speak to the prohibition of registering illicit organizations, and we need to contrast that with other laws on the ground enforced in that country, and then additional information from organizations who attempted to register and were unsuccessful. Those are the three only exceptions. We're not able to track enforcement. So we understand that in many, many countries, there might be a legal reality which might look okay, even very progressive and on the books, but then the reality is totally different. And we see that in several countries, not only in Central America, where we know that there are high rates of violence, but also around the world. So we just like to call everyone's attention to the fact that legal reality speaks of a tiny portion of what's going on. It does speak to progress if it's not the case, or to the situation of oppression if there's criminalization, of course. But contextual information, additional information, should always be added to a larger analysis. This report serves as one of many tools that can be used to assess the situation on the ground. Let me just finish by saying that it has been a huge, huge privilege to work with the panelists that you were able to meet today. Each one of them has enriched the report with their own perspectives, their expertise, their abilities, and their passion. It was just an unforgettable experience to share this time with all of them. And I really hope that that effort is appreciated in the report, and that the information that we were able to put together is used to further equality all around the world. I believe we don't have any more questions on the chat box. So we will leave it here, and please feel free to reach out to us at research@ilga.org. Thank you very much.